Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Narkis Street Congregation's Bible study on the Book of Acts here in Jerusalem. And we continue on with Paul's adventures. And now he's going to be going from Jerusalem to Caesarea tonight in Acts 23. So let's pray to open. Lord, we thank you for being with us at all times, even times that seem hard. And we just ask for your peace that passes all understanding to hold us and to guide us, and also to open your word to us and to speak to us and to give us something fresh tonight, wherever we are in this world. We ask this in your name, Jesus. Amen. All right, let's open by reading in Acts 23, starting in verse 12. The next morning, some Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. They went to the chief priest and the elders and said, "We have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about his case. We are ready to kill him before he gets here." But when the son of Paul's sister heard of this plot, he went into the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him." So he took him to the commander. The centurion said, "Paul, the prisoner, sent for me and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you." The commander took the young man by the hand, drew him aside, and asked, "What is it you want to tell me?" He said, "Some Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. Don't give in to them, because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for him. They have taken an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are ready now, waiting for your consent to their request." The commander dismissed the young man with this warning: "Don't tell anyone that you have reported this to me." Then he called two of his centurions and ordered them, "Get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide horses for Paul so that he may be taken safely to Governor Felix." He wrote a letter as follows: "Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency, Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him. But I came with my troops and rescued him, for I had learned that he is a Roman citizen. I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin. I found that the accusation had to do with questions about their law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. When I was informed of a plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. I also ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him." So the soldiers, carrying out their orders, took Paul with them during the night, and they brought him as far as Antipatris. The next day, they let the cavalry go on with him, while they returned to the barracks. When the cavalry arrived in Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and handed Paul over to him. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from. Learning that he was from Cilicia, he said, "I will hear your case when your accusers get here." Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace. So let's just go back with a gentle review of the context that's going on here as Paul's life is being threatened by a conspiracy in Jerusalem here in Acts 23. And so you'll recall this is around the year 57 AD. We're in Jerusalem. It's the time of Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, one of the three biblical pilgrimage festivals to Jerusalem. And Paul has just been on the Temple Mount at the temple in Jerusalem, and he's been grabbed, arrested by the Romans because a lynch mob was trying to kill him. And they've now taken him to the Roman Antonia Fortress, which is next to the Temple Mount. And Paul had been falsely accused by some diaspora Jews who were there at the temple, saying they had seen him bring a Gentile into the temple. And so he's being held in the barracks of the Roman Antonia Fortress here in the red. And the temple's off there at the top in the white. And the Sanhedrin would have been somewhere on the side of the temple complex there. And so Paul is here in the fortress, and the governor, which we've just read about here in Acts 23, is Felix, and his seat of power is in Caesarea, which is on the coast, not too far from Jerusalem. And he will travel back and forth from Caesarea to Jerusalem. And the high priest at this time in Jerusalem is Annas, son of Nedabeus. And he, as we talked about last Bible study, is quite a piece of work. And I say that in the most sarcastic way. He's he was appointed by his uncle, um, and actually Herod of Chalcis. I think that might have been his brother. Sorry, not his brother. Herod of Chalcis appointed him, and he is the uncle of Herod Agrippa II. And Annas ben Nidabeas was the second longest high priest who served in Jerusalem during the time of the Romans. Only Caiaphas served longer. So Annas had now been serving almost 12 years, and he was extremely pro-Roman and considered a collaborator with their imperial administration. He had become quite wealthy through his corruption and accepting of bribes and influencing officials. And he's eventually going to be deposed by Herod Agrippa II. And that's going to be about a year or so later. And then eventually, another, I guess that's like 8 years, he's going to be killed by Jewish zealots as the Jewish rebellion is starting against the Romans. But in general, what we know about him is mainly from Josephus and what we have here in Acts. Um, Josephus portrays him as corrupt, arrogant, and very harsh, especially towards other priests. And so Josephus writes about this high priest Ananias, who we saw in the last Bible study, the one who ordered that Paul be slapped. Josephus describes him as a great hoarder of money, and he had servants who worked for him that were very wicked, and they got together with the most insolent men, and they went to the threshing floors, and they took away the tithes that belonged to the priest by violence, and did not refrain from beating such as would not give these tithes to them. So the other high priest acted in the like manner, as did those his servants, without anyone being able to prohibit them. So that some of the priests that of old were wont to be supported with those tithes died for want of food. So let me translate this for you, if you didn't catch all of this. The priest, as we all know from the Bible, lived off of the tithes that the people would bring in from their harvest, from their agriculture. And so the priests would receive these tithes of offering, and that's how they would eat and live. But at this time, this high priest, Ananias ben Nabonias, he was very wicked and very greedy, and he was taking away from the lower class priest what they deserve, their food to live on. And so it was like a mafia of coercion, and he was taking advantage of his power for his benefit. And he was using violent means to do it. And at the same time, with this corruption that's been building and the aristocracy of Jerusalem's high priest, you have this other group called the Jewish Zealots. Again, we hear about the Zealots from the writings of Josephus, this Jewish historian of the first century. And the Zealots are wanting to overthrow the Roman occupation. And Josephus writes about them appearing during his time in the first century. It's a resistance movement against the Romans, so it's a political identity. Josephus calls them the fourth philosophy in contrast to the other three philosophies of Judaism at that time: Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. Josephus names Judas the Galilean as the founder of the Zealots. That would have been 50 years prior to this story with Paul being arrested. And ultimately, the Zealots continue to exist for a couple of generations, and Josephus blames them for instigating the Jewish revolt against the Romans, which would come about a decade after this episode with Paul. Another group from this time are the Sicarii, which is a nickname for these, you could call them terrorists, who went around with knives, short curved daggers under their clothes, and they were an extremist group of the Zealots who would assassinate Romans and Jewish collaborators with the Romans. And so they would hide their daggers under their clothes, and they would murder people in public without them knowing what had happened before they had bled out. And so this was part of their identity, that they were serving God, if you would, with their violence. And it was during the time of Felix, the governor Felix, who is here in Acts 23, that the Sicarii attacks are increasing, and the people are feeling less and less secure with them running around. And also because the Romans are trigger happy as well. They know that these terrorists are hiding among the average people in the crowd. And so, for instance, the Sicarii are going to murder a former high priest about a year after Paul's episode here, his arrest here. Josephus writes about it in Antiquities of the Jews, that Jonathan, the high priest, who had apparently reproved Felix, so that's the Roman governor, for the many iniquities or wrongs he had committed. Felix is very corrupt. We will talk more about him in the next Bible study, what he is known for. Jonathan the high priest would speak out against him. And so Felix had gotten tired of hearing Jonathan the high priest talk about his sins. And so Felix persuaded one of Jonathan's trusted friends, Doris, to bring brigands upon him And when he had come up to the feast, these brigands rushed into the temple, being concealed under their garments, and slew Jonathan and his companions. And because this murder was not punished, from that time the brigands went on with greater boldness. So, who are these brigands, these bandits, these outlaws that were, I guess, hired or somehow connected to Felix releasing them? They are violent men, and Josephus often kind of talks about these violent men or brigands running around Jerusalem at this time and into the Jewish revolt, kind of like anarchy, where wild gangs doing what they want. And so the Sicarii, even though it doesn't say the Sicarii killed Jonathan the high priest, they are very much related to these brigands or these violent men. And so as we get closer to the Jewish revolt, the Sicarii are going to be known for how brutal they are, not just to the Romans, but to their own fellow Jews. And Josephus writes about what the Sicarii would do um, to their fellow Jews. They butchered many of the nobility. They plundered the wealthier citizens and killed them all. This is going to come later when the Jewish revolt starts and they take power in Jerusalem. And they threw them in prison and they burned their houses of the ones they had murdered and they plundered their property. For they regarded their own fellow citizens, their own fellow Jewish citizens, exactly as if they were enemies and injured them in every possible way. And they did all this without the slightest hesitation, but with great audacity and lawlessness. And then he writes further that a group of these Sicarii, around the time of the end of the Jewish revolt, went over to Cyrene, that's in North Africa, and there they inflicted countless attacks upon the local Jews until Catulus, the governor, suppressed the revolt, and he executed many of them and sent Jonathan in chains to Rome. And in fact, you remember the famous story of Masada, the group that ends up at Masada at the end, holding out against the Romans before they all commit suicide. That group were predominantly Sicarii. So, summing all of this up, the historical and political context for tonight in Acts 23, with Paul being arrested and having his life threatened by a conspiracy of violent men, the Romans are seen by the Jewish people as occupiers of their land, and they're Gentile occupiers who are trying to control them and their customs and their politics and even influencing their religious practices. The chief priests of Jerusalem's temple are the most important players in this equation because they are in charge of the most important religious practice for Jews here in the first century because they're in charge of the temple. And yet they have been corrupted by Roman power and they predominantly have turned towards abusing the average Jewish citizen. So the Jewish people in Jerusalem and around are restless and dissatisfied with all of this corruption, this bad leadership. And so they are very open to multiple messianic attempts to overthrow Rome's rule. And so that could often look like these zealots who bring in violence or who bring in some sort of plan or vision uh, to violently overthrow the Romans. And any Jews who were appearing to be friendly with the Romans, with these Gentiles, would have been seen as collaborators and therefore they also could be murdered as traitors to their own people. And this leaves us with Paul. Paul is preaching as he comes to Jerusalem that Gentiles can join the people of God and they don't have to be circumcised or observe Torah. In other words, they don't have to become Jews. They can be who they are and follow Jesus in um, that way, not as Jews, but as Gentiles. With with the Jerusalem Council Acts 15 requirements, but um, in their own unique part of God's kingdom. And so Paul would have been seen here by the nationalists, like the Zealots, the extremists, the Sicarii, as he would have been seen as a threat to this Jewish identity that they were preaching and trying to keep pure. So here's our story tonight. Some Jews formed a conspiracy. They're not going to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. And it involved more than 40 men in the plot. So this plan, this conspiracy, this plot it's a number of people that are going to do something against someone or some institution, and they've bound themselves with an oath. The Greek there is anathematisan, which you'll notice that first part uh, where we get the word anathema from, which is invoking a divine harm or a curse if someone does not carry out what has been promised. In Hebrew, same concept with haram, Arabic, haram. It's the same idea that if you don't do what you say, you're calling a curse down upon yourself. And so this is a very serious plan, a very serious plot, and it's involving a large group of men, more than 40. So this is a serious attempt to kill Paul because if there's going to be Romans there who are armed, you're going to need a tactical force to be able to overwhelm them to get at Paul. And this group, this over 40 men group, go to the chief priests and the elders, and they say, "We want to kill Paul. All you have to do is summon the commander to bring Paul back to the Sanhedrin, maybe the next day or whatever, and then we will kill him before he even gets to the Sanhedrin." So it's not a very long walk there in the temple, and it would be crowded with people. And but here's a interesting weird thing to think about. Why are the zealots who hate Rome, they want to get rid of them, trying to cooperate with the chief priest? Because the chief priest depend on Rome for their power. They would seem to be ideologically opposite. And Josephus, though, shows that these two groups, even though they're coming from two ends of the spectrum, they would cooperate indirectly sometimes when it served their short-term interest. So maybe think of it as a government coalition, especially in modern Israel today or Europe, where you have various parties align for shared short-term agendas, which benefit both groups. And in the case tonight in Acts 23, what's their short-term shared agenda? It's to kill Paul. Why did the high priest of the temple want Paul dead? Because he's messing with the temple. He's been accused of defiling the temple. He's caused angry crowds to pop up at the temple. And all of this threatens their control of the temple because the Romans want peace and quiet. And if the high priests are not able to keep the crowd in line, ultimately that's going to bring about change, maybe firing the high priest, bringing in another one. So that's part of why they're out to get Paul, the high priest. And then the other side is the zealots. Paul has been rumored to be undermining Israel's covenant identity by bringing in these Gentiles. And so he's a traitor to Jewish nationalism. So they both have the common short-term agenda of eliminating Paul, the zealots, and the high priest. But the son of Paul's sister heard about this plot. So this is Paul's nephew. So Paul's family, we haven't heard much about Paul's family. We know he's from the tribe of Benjamin, but as far as parents or siblings, we've heard nothing. So this is the first family member of Paul that has popped up, and this nephew. And question to be had, was his family, his extended family, living in Jerusalem? Because even though Paul is from Cilicia, he's from Tarsus, he said in the previous chapter how he grew up in Jerusalem sitting at the feet of Gamaliel. So Paul has lived in Jerusalem, and it would make sense to have his family living here as well, his extended family. Now, are they believers, followers of Jesus? We don't know. Or maybe they're not from Jerusalem, and maybe like the nephew was just visiting Jerusalem on pilgrimage for Shavuot. We will never know, at least not in this life, but it's something to think about, ponder. So the centurion took Paul's nephew to the commander, and he had the young man tell him what he's heard, that some Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow. Don't give in to them because 40 of them, or more than 40 of them, are waiting to ambush him and kill him. And they're not going to eat or drink until they kill him. So they're going to be getting more and more desperate to get this over with. And this is all going to happen tomorrow. They're just waiting for you to give your consent. And Josephus gives an account here about how the Sicarii, the ones who carried these daggers, would do their work of killing people. They'd hide their daggers under their cloaks. Then they would walk among the crowds at the festivals in the temple, and then quickly stab their targets, their enemies. And as I said earlier, their first victim that got going was the high priest Jonathan. And so that's going to happen soon after Paul's story here. They will start killing more people. And listen to the way Josephus describes the terror that they brought to the average person just after this time. The terror was worse than the actual harm, for everyone, as in wartime, expected death at any moment. Even when enemies saw one another from a distance, they were afraid. And even when they met in the temple, they had no security from each other. Such was the audacity and boldness of the Sicarii. So no place is sacred. If you're killing somebody on the Temple Mount, you really, I mean, in a sense, you're murder, and that's making this area impure there on the area outside of the temple. But this is possibly is what is going to happen to Paul if the next day he's brought out from the Roman fortress to the Sanhedrin. He will be surrounded by men in cloaks, and they will pull out their daggers and stab him. And so the commander listens to this and takes it very seriously, and he calls together two centurions to get a detachment of soldiers, horsemen, a cavalry, spearmen, and to leave at night and take Paul to Caesarea. So this Roman commander that we've been talking about, he's come up 4 or 5 times now in this story. He's also the one who originally arrested Paul and thought he was the Egyptian revolutionary, the one who had this Roman commander had bought his Roman citizenship. He was more than just a generic commander. He was a commander of 1,000 men, anywhere from 1,000 to 600. And we'll find out in his letter to Felix, his name is Claudius Lysias. So he's a significant person here, and he's calling together, let's see, it's about 470 men. So it's just short of a cohort that is going to transport Paul to Caesarea. So this is a serious attachment of soldiers to accompany Paul to Caesarea. And in his letter, Claudius gives the details to the Roman governor Felix and tells him how he was seized by the Jews and they were about to kill him, about to lynch him, but he rescued him. For I had learned that he is a Roman citizen. And he's kind of telescoping it here because you'll remember back in Acts 21, 22, he didn't find out he was a Roman citizen till after he was going to begin flogging him or scourging him. And that's when Paul told him he was a citizen, when he was actually in the barracks. But then he took him to the Sanhedrin, and because he's a citizen, um, he's got certain rights that the average person in the Roman Empire does not have. Roman citizens had specific rights and protections guaranteed under Roman law. And one of them was the right to due process. And so Paul could not be lynched. That's not legal. And he could not be executed for something that did not deserve execution. And that's what the commander writes here, that they're accusing him of something regarding their law. He's talking about the Torah, the Jewish, the law of Moses. But the commander says, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. And so he heard about this plot and he's sending Paul to Felix for him to make a court case to decide what what or if anything Paul has done wrong and what his punishment should be. And so his accusers are going to be sent to Caesarea to have this trial about Paul's apparent crime. So the soldiers carry Paul out that night and they bring him as far as Antipatris. So Antipatris is an interesting place. Originally, it's known as Afek, and it's it had 5,000 years of continual inhabitation since the times of the Canaanites and before. And it's located on the Sharon Plain in central Israel, at the head springs of the Yarkon River, very close to Tel Aviv today, and even closer to the cities of Rosh Ayin and Petach Tikva. And what made Antipatris or Afek interesting for our story tonight and in historical geography is its springs and its location are close to the coast. And because of that water that would seep out and go towards the ocean, the Mediterranean Sea, it caused the land to not be passable for large armies or large groups of traffic. And so the traffic would have to go into the east side of the country, east of Afek. And so that was known, that road to the east of Afek, Antipatris, was known as the International Coastal Highway, which ran all the way from Egypt to Mesopotamia. Today we talk about the Middle East, the area there with Iraq and Iran. So it's over 1,000 miles, this International Coastal Highway. Here's here's a map of it. You can see it running up from Egypt through Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Afek there in the red. And then it would continue up to the Carmel, to the fortress of Megiddo, which is where we get the word Armageddon from in the book of Revelation about the final battle being there in relation to Megiddo. And in fact, there were many international battles that were fought there when armies would come from the east and the west, and they would meet in this area there. And then the highway would continue northwards. Um, so this was the international highway here. And so Afek, again, this is where Antipatris is, that Paul would come to, is this ancient city, and it's written about by the pharaohs and hieroglyphs in Egypt, how it was conquered. It was a Canaanite royal city. It's mentioned in Joshua and Judges, and it was also apparently a Philistine settlement. It's mentioned as the place where the Philistines camped when they fought the Israelites and they captured the Ark of the Covenant there in 1 Samuel 4. And then later on, after David and Solomon and the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians, the Hasmoneans would come, the Maccabees, they would come and take Afek and make it part of their fortification line just before the time of Jesus because of its spot there near the ocean. And it got its new name, Antipatris, from Herod the Great, who rebuilt it and renamed it Antipatris after his father, Antipater, there in 9 BC. And obviously, he built it with his Greek Roman style of a forum, cardo, theater, mausoleum. There's not a lot of remains from that time period, but what archaeologists have been some part of the forum, a part of the main street, the Cardo, and a small theater. And it would go on to be this strategic defensive city for the following empires after the Romans. But again, the main connection for our story tonight with Paul is it ran um, up the coast from Jerusalem to Caesarea, and it was a Roman fortress, highly fortified. And so this is where Paul is being taken in a hurry because of the threat to his life. And so there's Antipatris about halfway between Jerusalem to Caesarea, where the first arrow is pointing. And you see, it's not far from Jaffa either, which is where Jonah went on the ship and towards Tarshish way back when. Joppa is where Peter had the vision of the sheet of animals coming down, and then went up to Caesarea to visit Cornelius after his vision was had the visitors come and bring him there. So here's an image of that cardo, that Roman road. It's got chariot wheels and pushed down into the rocks. So you can see where when you're there, you can see where the chariot wheels would have run on that road. This is that little theater, the Odeum, that they found there. And this is an Ottoman fortress. This is around 400 or so years old on the waters. And today there's a national park, the Yarkon National Park in the Israeli National Park System. And on that includes the Tel for Afek, Tel Afek. And one other thing, a lot of people, especially Christians who come to visit the land there, um, the there is this place called the Baptist Village, and it was founded in the 50s. And Bob Lindsay, who was a pastor here at Narkis at that time, was the person who kind of instigated building this Baptist kibbutz there. And it was right on the headwaters of Afek. This is the Baptist village today, looking in the direction of the coast. But when the Baptist village was founded in the 50s, it actually was on the land of the Afek Springs and where Antipatris was, where Paul stayed. Now the national parks have taken back some of that land and fenced in the area that they've made the national park. But originally, the people, I've heard stories about the orphans and the different people that lived there back in those days would go and swim in the springs like it was their own backyard. And so the effect, the national park is just not towards those tall buildings, but the opposite direction, back here in the shade. It's behind the grove of trees that you can't see, but down at the bottom of the screen. And this is on the other side, looking at the national park of the Yardcon. And so they're bringing Paul the next day from Antipatris up to Caesarea, and they arrive there. And just to remind ourselves, Caesarea is an amazing city at this time. It's newly built. Well, not that new. It's around 60, 70 years old, but relatively new. It's got all the latest fashion, and this is where the Roman governor Felix sits. Previously, Pontius Pilate had that was where he was too in the days of Jesus. And so Paul is going to arrive through one of those gates, and he's going to be brought to the governor's house with all of these Roman soldiers. And they're going to hand the letter from the commander back in Jerusalem to Felix, and he's going to read it, and he's going to find out that Paul is from Cilicia. He's a Roman citizen. He's like, okay, so we'll have our trial. I'll listen to your case when your accusers get here. And so they put Paul under guard in Herod's palace. And if you've been to Caesarea on the coast, you'll know that there is the palace of Herod that juts out into the ocean. The arrows are pointing out the length of the palace, and that circle there in the red is the area that they believe that Paul would have been held there underground. And it's very close to the theater there at Caesarea. You see it right above there. And this is what it looks like today, the palace. It's mainly been wiped out, going out towards the ocean, but kind of in the middle of that rock structure, in the middle of the waves, you can see a pool. There was a pool that was cut into the rocks. I believe it was fed from ocean water at the time that Herod built it. And this is where Herod the Great lived, and all of the Roman governors like Pontius Pilate, and now Felix is living here as well. And again, the red circle is the approximate area of where Paul would have been held according to tradition and um, findings there. So, as we're coming to the conclusion here for tonight, there is a there's an explanation that's written in rabbinic literature for why the temples were destroyed. And it's in the Babylonian Talmud, this famous quote that's used often, where why was the first temple destroyed? Because of three things which prevailed in it during its time. In other words, idolatry, immorality, and bloodshed, murder. But why was the second temple destroyed? And so, what's the second temple? That's right now the temple of Herod, the temple that Jesus walked around, the one that Paul has just been arrested at. So, the first temple that was destroyed by the Babylonians was destroyed for these three big sins: idolatry, sexual immorality, and murder. But why is the second temple destroyed? Because its time, they occupied themselves with Torah, mitzvot, and acts of kindness. So, in other words, why would the second temple be destroyed when there were a lot of people who were religious or pious, uh, observing the commandments? And the writer writes here in Yoma 9b, it was destroyed because of baseless hatred. Baseless hatred prevailed, sinat chinam. And this idea of free hatred, hatred with no cause. Um, and so I just, based off of all the readings we did tonight in Josephus and this group of guys that so badly want to kill Paul, where they won't even eat or drink, you have to think like, wow, that you have to really believe in killing him if you're willing to take that kind of oath. And so I want to end tonight in the conclusion in Paul's own words, since he's the one who is being threatened here as the climax of our story tonight. I want to end with how perhaps he might give the conclusion tonight from 1 Corinthians 13, where Paul famously writes, if I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love.